Hello, everybody, and welcome to our carbon management webinar. We are really delighted as the Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management with the U.S. Department of Energy to share some of what we've been doing within fossil energy and carbon management with you today, specifically focused on carbon. If you saw our invitations, I imagine all of you realize that we're doing this today at 12:01 on 12:01 because 12:01 is the atomic mass of carbon, which is something that we really are very excited about managing here in the Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management. My name is Emily Grubert. I'm the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Carbon Management within FECM, and I'm going to be the MC today and just basically tee up a couple of really nice presentations by some of the people in our office to explain a bit about what we've been doing here. And so without further ado, I'm actually going to introduce our Acting Assistant Secretary, Dr. Jennifer Wilcox, to talk a little bit about some of the great initiatives and some of the progress that we've been making in FECM. So Jen, let me turn it over to you, and thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Emily. Excited to be here. Thanks everybody for joining us today. Emily, you can go to the next slide. So one thing that you're going to notice is we've changed the name of our office. So on July 4th, we added two really important names to our Office of Fossil Energy. So we're now the Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management. And we've done some reorganization in light of that name change and in light of the new administration. You're probably all aware of the climate goals, but I'll outline them here just briefly. The administration has set three major goals. The first one being 50% emissions reduction by 2030, which is less than a decade away, 100% clean electricity by 2035, and net zero carbon emissions by mid-century. And so in addition to these climate goals, there's also been a number of goals set forth on justice and equity. So as we invest in different approaches across the Department of Energy, we really want to make sure that those investments are leading to benefits to communities. And so one of the initiatives is the Justice 40 initiative, but there's also the Interagency Working Group on Coal and Power Plant Communities and Economic Revitalization. And so in light of these goals, we've also, as I mentioned, reorganized our office. And so we have two primary categories across all of the investments in the Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management. And they focus on these two that I mentioned here, that I list here. The first is, how do we extract fossil fuels out of the earth today? We have an entire office associated with this. And so it's the Office of Resource Sustainability. Previously, it was the Oil and Gas Office. And so what we're doing in that office is specifically investing in approaches that minimize the environmental impacts of how we extract oil, gas, and coal out of the earth today. This could be all the way from preventing induced seismicity to handling produced water to methane mitigation. In addition, the question is once we extract those fossil fuels, how do we use them for energy extraction? And so our second office is really focused on carbon management, and it's the Office of Carbon Management. And in that case, we're really focusing on the pollution associated with how we use fossil fuels for energy generation, and that these two, the supply chain of the fossil fuels coupled to how it's used, are absolutely coupled. And so next slide. And next slide. And so before I talk a little bit about the RD&D focus areas, I want to just take a step back too and have you take a look at our new mission, and feel free to read through this. But again, I'm just going to highlight in general what we're doing in our office is, as we're investing in approaches, we're not just drawing the box around the power plant, around the LNG facility, or around a blue hydrogen facility. We're really asking the question of the upstream impacts and drawing the box much bigger of the connection between the fossil fuel resource and how we use it. And making sure that if our goal is low carbon electricity, or if it's low carbon hydrogen, blue hydrogen, we want to make sure that the upstream emissions are also captured in that calculation. And it's not just about the greenhouse gas emissions like methane and CO2, but it's also about the environmental impacts that the production of those fossil fuels have on communities. And so a lot of our work is centered around public engagement as well. As we look at investing in technologies from a low R&D level all the way up to pilots, to demonstrations, and ultimately wide-scale deployment, those technologies are going into communities. And so we want to be able to make sure that we have communication with communities to make sure that there's an understanding of the technology that's being deployed, and that also that the benefits to the communities are realized. And so this is a really big component to the work that we're doing. Next slide. And so in this next slide, you'll see a number of RDD and D priorities, and I'm just going to talk about a few of them. But we'll start in the upper left. And a lot of our work that we've been investing in over the last 2 decades is associated with CCS, carbon capture, and storage associated with the power sector. And so we're continuing that work, but we're really focusing on higher technological readiness levels, approaches that are really ready to be either at the pilot or demonstration scale today. And also being more inclusive of approaches like natural gas power plants, which are expected to persist through mid-century in some cases, and then also expanding to include the industrial sector. Industrial sectors like cement production or steel production. And that's also coupled to our efforts in low carbon supply chains. And so when you look at, when you look at corporates that are making net zero pledges today, oftentimes these low carbon supply chains don't exist. And so one of the efforts that we're doing is also making more clear on our website, and you can already start to see some of the changes if you take a look at our updated website, of being able to understand where our investments are going in terms of carbon capture on a cement plant, for instance, that would ultimately lead to a supply chain of low carbon cement, or carbon capture on a blast furnace of a steel production facility, for instance. And we want to make those investments transparent. We want to make sure that the private sector is aware that we're investing in these sectors. A lot of times for corporations, those sectors are a scope 3 emissions and not something that they can control. And so oftentimes carbon removal offsets are purchased for scope 3 emissions, but it's much cheaper to actually capture the CO2 at the source than having to pull it back out of the atmosphere. And so this is an effort that we're trying to do in terms of just communicating and transparency associated with the investments that we're making. The other piece that I want to point out, again, when it comes to steel production, when it comes to cement production, when it comes to power sector today, you also have to think about the fossil fuels that are feeding into that process. And so we have an entire effort focused on reducing methane emissions. And so first really is associated with the quantification of methane, being able to understand what the leakage looks like today. Again, making that data so that it's transparent and available publicly. And then when we choose projects, whether it's on a power sector or an industrial sector, we really want to make sure that the box is drawn as large as possible so that we can, if we're producing, for instance, low carbon electricity, you have to include the carbon intensity or the CO2 equivalent intensity of the supply chain that's fed into that, that utility. And so this is a really important piece. The other aspect that I'll point out here is the critical minerals priority area. And this is a really easy story to tell, in fact. So when we think about waste materials from fossil fuels, whether it's acid mine drainage, whether it's fly ash impoundments, or maybe it's even tailings from a coal mine, a lot of times these waste materials have critical minerals, have rare earth elements that have high value. And it's these types of critical minerals and rare earth elements that we're going to need as we increase the production of batteries, as we increase the production of magnets, which are all going to be needed in order to have the renewable penetration into the grid that we're expecting to meet the 2035 clean electricity goals. And today we're not resourcing those critical minerals locally or regionally. And so there's an opportunity here. And there's also a component of restorative justice associated with this. A lot of times the fossil waste has legacy impacts on communities, on ecosystems, on the environment. And so there's an opportunity to not just extract value in terms of critical minerals, but also a restorative justice piece in bringing those ecosystems and those environments back to a more natural state that they were ahead of the impact of the fossil fuels. Another important area that I want to touch upon here is hydrogen. And so in the area of hydrogen, We're looking at feedstocks, not just conventional feedstocks that we have done previously, like waste plastic or waste coal or fossil feedstocks for hydrogen production, but we're also very interested in sustainable waste biomass. And so this is a really excellent opportunity when you gasify biomass and you couple the hydrogen production with carbon capture, it can actually lead to carbon removal. And so this could be a really impactful space. And so this is something that we're also shaping and excited about. And then on the note of carbon dioxide removal, it's become increasingly clear that in order to meet our net zero goals by mid-century, this needs to be a tool that we have in the kit. And so one aspect of that we try to emphasize about carbon removal is that it should not be seen as an offset for sectors that we can decarbonize, and we have technologies decarbonized today, like decarbonizing fossil fuels, for instance, like carbon capture at point sources. We, in our carbon management office, we actually decouple our two divisions. Carbon removal is in one division, point source carbon capture is in a separate division, and then further carbon transport and reliable storage is an entirely separate division. And so as we get appropriation dollars, those are very articulated in terms of where they go into each of these divisions. And then the other piece too that's important about carbon removal is that we're wanting to be very inclusive about all approaches and not just, for instance, looking at the engineered approaches to removing CO2 from the atmosphere. In fact, when you look at some of the other approaches outside of direct air capture, outside of using even minerals or biological systems, but you look at improved forest management, or you look at soil practices and agricultural opportunities to store carbon in the soil. If you're going to actually look at storing the carbon on a timescale that positively impacts climate, those might look like engineered systems too. And it's still unclear what the cost of monitoring those nature-based projects are over time. And so this is an effort that we're excited about. And the final thing I'll say is, for those of you that may not know, but we do have also an active funding opportunity announcement specifically on direct air capture. And what that looks like, I think the due date is the 22nd of the month, but what that looks like is what we're trying to do is we recognize that it's expensive in terms of energy to take CO2 out of the atmosphere. It's very dilute. And so we're looking at trying to encourage applicants to think about direct air capture technologies as they couple to existing energy producers today, existing utilities. Examples include nuclear and also geothermal. And in those processes, there are opportunities to couple direct air capture with either the steam or the heat that are encompassed within those processes. But even though we want those to be thermally driven, it's important to recognize that the heat and the level or the quality of the heat provided to the direct air capture approach may not be as high as what's needed. And so there may be, an opportunity to also couple to, say, a heat pump in order to boost the energy. One exciting project, for instance, is looking at supercomputing sites that generate a lot of heat. The heat is much too low of quality to couple to direct air capture. Maybe it's 40 degrees C. But if you can still use that heat as a baseline and only have to bump it up so that you don't have to spend all the energy, there is a savings there. And so in that effort, we're really asking applicants to be creative about utilizing and using low-grade heat at least as a benchmark. When you look at something like nuclear, it looks a little different, because the nuclear, oftentimes with those utilities, they even might couple with hydrogen production because they're generating too much electricity for the grid to handle. And so another option outside of hydrogen is coupling to direct air capture so that the units are able to run 24/7, or at least a high capacity factor. And so ultimately, in the end, what we're trying to move toward is not just utilities that are producing low carbon electricity or carbon neutral electricity in some cases, but producing carbon negative electricity, which could be a really interesting tool when these approaches are coupled to direct air capture. So if you don't know about that funding opportunity announcement, I urge you to take a look, because we're really excited about it. And so with that, I'm gonna pass it back to Emily, and I think we'll get to hear from Suchi next.
Thank you so much, Jen. Really appreciate it. And I think I've been noticing coming through some of the Q&A in the chat, a lot of questions about carbon removal. I have really good news that we're next going to hear from Dr. Suchi Chelati, who's our Chief of Staff on carbon dioxide removal and specifically some of the work that we've been doing in that area across DOE. So I'll turn it over to Dr. Chelati.
Thanks so much, Emily, and hi, everyone. And thank you so much for joining us on the first Carbon Management Day. As Emily said, I'm Suchi Chelati. I'm the Chief of Staff of FECM, and I'll be talking a bit more about carbon dioxide removal, or CDR. Next slide, please. So CDR refers to approaches that capture CO2 directly from the atmosphere and durably store it in reservoirs or in some types of products to create negative emissions. These approaches are incredibly diverse and span the technological, land-based, and ocean-based space. A few examples of CDR approaches include direct air capture and storage, as Jen talked about, biomass with carbon removal and storage, enhanced mineralization, direct ocean capture, soil carbon sequestration, and afforestation. These are all very different, which means they have different potential benefits and risks and are applicable on different scales. Regardless, though, all of these approaches will require major investments in infrastructure. It's also important to clarify what CDR is not as well. CDR does not include natural CO2 uptake that is not caused by direct human intervention. And to reiterate what Dr. Wilcox said, CDR is also not point source carbon capture and storage, or CCS, from fossil fuel power plants or heavy industry. So why are we talking about CDR? Over the last few years, several modeling-based studies and reports have shown conclusively that alongside mitigation, CDR will now be needed at scale to reach our climate goals, including net zero by 2050. And I want to really emphasize Dr. Wilcox's point that this is only in addition to deep decarbonization. CDR absolutely should not be pursued or deployed in a vacuum. FECM is focused on making sure that CDR is deployed in a just and sustainable way. And so that means considering really important questions, including how different approaches will be applied, what RD&D needs each have, and how they should be deployed. We have to make sure that we are deeply thoughtful on resource use, like energy, land, and water, on what infrastructure will be needed, and how to ensure that justice considerations are prioritized. Importantly, CDR is an issue of both local and global justice. The United States has the opportunity to build an equitable industry that can benefit climate vulnerable populations globally. At FECM, we are investing in a lot of different pathways. This includes approaches that couple direct air capture to scalable use and storage, like Jen talked about. So that could be in a product like concrete, where it could be durably stored or stored geologically deep underground. We're also really aiming to expand carbon storage demonstration so that we have more projects distributed across the United States and in locations where CO2 injection deep underground is feasible. Storage also needs to be expanded to include enhanced mineralization of CO2, either in situ in existing geologic formations or ex situ through alkaline sources from waste and mining. Next slide, please. What I'd like to highlight now is the newest DOE initiative and the first major federal government effort on carbon dioxide removal. The Carbon Negative Shot was launched on November 5th at the UNFCCC COP26 in Glasgow. This is part of the DOE Energy Earthshots initiative, with a goal of durable and scalable carbon dioxide removal under $100 per net metric ton within a decade. There are really important performance elements that the Carbon Negative Shot defines for a necessary but nascent industry to ensure that CDR is both responsive to our climate change needs and done in a responsible way. First, we're targeting less than $100 per net metric ton of CO2 equivalent for both capture and storage. An important aspect of this value is that the way these costs might be distributed will see a lot of variability across approaches, but removal with storage and monitoring, reporting, and verification are above $100 per net ton of CO2 equivalent across the spectrum. Second, this Earthshot will require robust carbon accounting. The $100 per net ton of CO2 equivalent is inclusive of full lifecycle costs, including storage and monitoring, reporting, and verification, necessitating robust accounting to understand how much carbon dioxide is truly removed. The addition of the word net in this target is extremely deliberative for these reasons. The third element is durable 100-year storage. What this means is that pathways must lead to carbon storage where costs are demonstrated for 100 years. We need this long-term value because true removal only occurs with long-term reliable storage. Finally, we want to ensure that projects and pathways are focused on truly leading to enabling large-scale removal. So we want to ensure that we do not focus on the cases that might be below a cost target, but cannot enable access for climate targets. We're incredibly excited about the CDR effort, as well as expanding our CDR work more broadly across the agency. And this includes integrating robust and meaningful public engagement across an incredibly diverse set of stakeholders. This is all going to be extremely hard work, but DOE and FECM are dedicated to ensuring that it is done well. And with that, I will pass it back to Emily. I don't think she heard me. Emily, tagging you back in.
Sorry about that, everybody. Technical difficulties a little bit. I've lost my host controller, but fortunately it is my turn. So that's going to make this a little bit easier. Thank you so much, Dr. Talati, for that conversation about carbon dioxide removal. And I think next it is my turn to talk a little bit about some of what we're actually going to be doing in the near term within FECM. I'm also working on getting the slides back up. I realize that that's a little bit tricky, but working on it. One of the things that I think is really very exciting for us from the carbon management perspective is the opportunity to really work with a lot of the carbon management funding that's associated with the bipartisan infrastructure law. And one of the areas that we're very particularly excited about is the opportunity to really work very hard with the rest of the DOE and with the rest of the federal government to deploy quite a lot of resources toward carbon management specifically. Through the bipartisan infrastructure law, we're going to be deploying approximately $10 billion in new direct carbon management funding over the next 5 years. That includes a number of different approaches. So one of the big ones that people may have heard about in the past is this regional DAC hubs initiative that is coming through the bipartisan infrastructure law. That includes $3.5 billion for regional DAC hubs that will really help us understand how direct air capture can work and function as part of our carbon dioxide removal goals, reaching to the net zero goals that we have by 2050 for the country overall. Within that, we're also very interested in looking at some of the types of direct air capture technologies that are a bit earlier stage and other ones that may not be at the point of hub development. So the bipartisan infrastructure law also provides about $115 million for DAC technology prizes, which we're also very excited to be working with. On the engineered stack capture, more this point source carbon capture and storage element, we also see about $3.5 billion for carbon capture demonstrations and large pilots in the bipartisan infrastructure law, in addition to another $100 million on the carbon capture technology program. On the carbon dioxide utilization and storage side, we also see an additional $2.5 billion associated with really trying to show how carbon storage might work across the United States and giving us some opportunities to validate and test those the storage opportunities. One of the things that we very much emphasize within the Carbon Management Office is that storage is pretty critical, not just to some of the mitigative point source carbon capture that we anticipate needing for industrial decarbonization and some stuff in the power sector, but also for certain types of carbon dioxide removal that require storage. We also see $310 million for the carbon utilization program in this bipartisan infrastructure law. The next slide, please. Some of the additional carbon management funding that we see within the bipartisan infrastructure law focuses on a couple of areas where not everything is going to have carbon management, but will be actually very, very crucial for demonstrating some of these new technologies as well. One is the Clean Hydrogen Hubs program, which has about $8 billion allocated for 4 hydrogen hubs. At least one of those will be fossil fuel derived with carbon management. We anticipate working very closely with the rest of the government on ensuring that that is done. Another one in this area is the Carbon Dioxide Transportation Infrastructure Finance and Innovation Program account, which has another $2.1 billion associated with really trying to understand what the needs for carbon dioxide transportation might be in the future and making sure that we have the infrastructure in place to really achieve all of our carbon management goals. So with all of this, we're extraordinarily excited to see a lot of the deployment coming through with the bipartisan infrastructure law, in addition to the typical research and development that we're doing to ensure that we have lots and lots of technologies coming behind this for the long-term goals of reaching net zero. I will also tease quickly, we are planning on releasing a request for information, an RFI, in the carbon management space sometime in the next few weeks. So please be on the lookout for that if this is of interest, and we really anticipate lots and lots of responses and look forward to your input there. So really very excited about all of this carbon management funding and looking forward to seeing how this is deployed. With that, I actually will turn it over to Adam Wong, who is our Director for Strategic Engagement, to talk about some of our work with other agencies. Adam, you're on. Thank you.
Thanks, Emily. And thanks to everyone for joining today's Carbon Management webinar, and happy Carbon Management Day. As Dr. Gruber mentioned, I'm Adam Wong, the Director for Strategic Engagement in the Office of Carbon Management. Our team serves as the liaison for facilitating both global and domestic conversations related to carbon management, along with coordinating with other US government agencies. So I'll speak today to highlight some of these efforts, along with the signing of a new agreement with our colleagues from the US Geological Survey. So next slide, please. So at FECM, we have several international partnerships focused on carbon management. While this slide here does not show all of our multilateral engagements, I wanted to highlight a select few. The Clean Energy Ministerial, or CEM. It's a high-level global forum that promotes policies and programs that advance clean energy technology to share lessons learned and best practices, and to encourage the transition to a global energy economy. So CEM membership, it includes 28 countries and the European Commission. And of that, 13 are members of the CEM Carbon Capture, Utilization and Storage, or CCUS initiative. These 13 members have joined forces to accelerate CCUS together and to collaborate actively with both industry and the financial sector, because all of them are important in this endeavor to identify strategic CCUS hubs, to discuss future investment opportunities, and to discuss how government policies and approaches can be improved to make CCUS an attractive clean energy solution for industry and the financial sector. And according to the latest global status of the CCUS report from the Global CCS Institute, there are 135 commercial CCS facilities in the project pipeline around the world, and 27 of these are fully operational. But we know more work needs to be done. Another multilateral engagement on here is the Asia CCUS Network. Since we launched this in June 2021, governments of 13 countries have joined this network as members, and we have hundreds of public and private companies, academia, financial institutions, and regional international organizations as supporting members to share best practices for applications of CCUS in Asia. The International Energy Agency, or IEA, which I'm sure many of you all are familiar with under the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, or OECD, works to ensure reliable, affordable, and clean energy for its 29 member countries and beyond. Here in FECM, we work with the IEA CCUS unit, along with many of the IEA's technology collaboration programs, such as the IEA Greenhouse Gas R&D program. And as part of our US leadership, Secretary Granholm will chair the next IEA ministerial meeting in February at the IEA offices in Paris. The Carbon Sequestration Leadership Forum, or CSLF, was established in 2003 as a global multilateral initiative focused on the development of improved, cost-effective technologies for CCS. The CSLF, it's comprised of 26 members, including 25 countries in the European Commission, and provides a platform for countries to coordinate research and activities. Accelerating CCS Technologies, or ACT. It's an international initiative to facilitate the RD&D and innovation on CCS. It has 14 members, and they're working together with the ambition to fund world-class RD&D innovation that can lead to safe and cost-effective CCS technologies. And Dr. Talati earlier mentioned DOE's new carbon negative shot, announced last month at COP26. Also at COP26, Secretary Granholm announced a new mission innovation, or MI, effort on CDR. Co-led by the US, Canada, and Saudi Arabia, this mission is the world's first public-private partnership to accelerate the RD&D of CDR. And at COP26, Secretary Granholm also announced that the US will be hosting the next FECM Ministerial and Mission Innovation Ministerial meetings in September in Pittsburgh. So we're looking forward to continuing our work with both our domestic and international colleagues as we plan to host this significant event. Next slide, please. And finally, we are happy to announce that FECM recently signed a Memorandum of Understanding, or MOU, with the US Geological Survey, or USGS, to establish cooperation between our two agencies to assess the global, regional, and national resources for geologic carbon storage. Under this partnership, our two agencies will collaborate with multiple international governments, geologic surveys, and other organizations. These organizations, they actually include some of the multilateral partnerships I just mentioned, as we look to leverage our existing partnerships to work with USGS to identify countries with a particular emphasis on emerging economies that are interested in working together to estimate their CO2 resources to meet their climate goals. Our effort will include providing international technical assistance through discussions, meetings, workshops, and research activities that will ultimately contribute to a better understanding of both current and potential resources for geological CO2 storage. By identifying these storage resources, we can better understand the deployment investment opportunities of global CCS and CDR projects as we work together towards helping to meet our global climate goals and the administration's mission to produce 100% clean electricity by 2035 and net zero carbon emissions by 2050. So thanks to everyone for listening in today, and I'll turn it back over to Emily.
Thank you so much, Adam. Really appreciate that overview of what we're doing in those areas. And next, it's my pleasure to introduce John Latinsky, who's our Director for Carbon Transport and Storage, and we'll be talking a bit about some programs in those areas. So John, take it away. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily, and thank you for letting me talk about a very important program, one of our flagship programs within the Office of Carbon Management, especially on this day, which is especially a day to celebrate carbon management at DOE and with all the stakeholders that we work with. So I'm going to talk a little bit about a notice of intent that we just issued, which will be releasing a funding opportunity announcement to expand our Carbon Safe program. So next slide, please. So what is Carbon Safe? I'm not sure if you're all aware of it, but it is one of our flagship programs, which is looking to develop commercial storage facilities around the United States so that we can basically build the infrastructure for capture projects and storage projects and transportation systems to take advantage of the vast resources of geologic storage we have in the United States. The program was started several years ago. It has 4 phases. The first is a feasibility phase. Second is an active pre-feed phase, and then pre-feasibility into site characterization, and finally into our final phase, which is commercial development of the facilities. We currently have several projects going on in the first 3 phases and developing commercial facilities, leading to the actual development of the facilities themselves for testing and monitoring CO2 injection and getting to Class 6 permitting of each one of the sites. Next slide, please. So why is it important for Carbon Safe to do this activity? Well, we know the storage capacity exists in the United States. If you look at what the Society for Petroleum Engineers Storage Resource Management System, our classification framework developed several years ago, we recognize that the prospective storage resources that we had identified throughout the United States, both by USGS and NATL through the regional partnerships, made it clear that we had vast resources to develop for commercial storage throughout the United States, as Emily mentioned, for either point source capture or some CDR approaches. But it was clear that those resources needed to be developed up a ladder of commercial development. And the Carbon Safe program specifically targets that opportunity to help secure that storage as for commercial development. You can see each phase of the Carbon Safe program kind of brings the resource capacity up from prospective resources to contingent resources to what we would call commercial capacity resources. This next FOA will actually look to continue to advance some of the existing projects, but bring new projects in to look for new areas around the United States where we could develop these facilities. Next slide, please. And so finally, a little bit about the notice of intent specifically. We announced that we'll make up to $33.2 million of appropriated R&D funds for carbon storage available through this funding opportunity announcement. This is not to be confused with the $2.5 billion that Emily mentioned previously. So this is coming directly out of our appropriated R&D program, but it can be leveraged for that future program. We're just still in the planning stages on how we're going to integrate these programs together. But really the objectives, as I mentioned before, is to accelerate the deployment of both on and offshore geologic storage at scale. Most of our carbon save projects to date have all focused on onshore, so we're looking to expand that to offshore. Understanding our, helping to understand and expand our capability to identify, characterize, permit some of these facilities so we can advance them in commercial development ladder. What we did change this time, and we're still developing the FO, but it was in the NOI. We're looking at least two areas of interest. One, looking at developing facilities that can store at least 50 million tons within a 30-year period, which has been the focus of the current carbon save, or look at larger scale facilities, really infrastructure facilities that would be hubs for carbon storage, where you could bring multiple sources into one site, store at least 50 million tons over 10 years. So that looks at much larger injection rates, at least 5 million tons a year or more, so that we could look at multiple industrial and power plant and or CDR facilities, all using a common sink. And the complexes would really look to develop this reliable storage for the existing regional networks, and part of that is actually developing the pipeline infrastructure, either through feasibility or FEED studies, but understanding what it's going to take to move the CO2 from sources to sinks. Again, this is, as we mentioned before, a foundational technology for the decarbonization of many sectors. It's going to be necessary to actually develop these facilities in the next 5 to 10 years so that the storage capacity is there as the capture systems come online and they can actually utilize this infrastructure. So again, thank you very much for your time. I'm very happy to highlight at least one of the aspects of the program that's really looking to advance the carbon storage and CCS for the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John. Really appreciate that overview. I think we do have a time for a couple of questions. I see a couple coming in through Q&A, and some of the stuff that we've heard from people in the past also focuses on this area. So I'm actually going to ask Dr. Shuchi-Chelati to talk a little bit about some of the strategies for CDR that go beyond direct air capture, and specifically thinking about things like nature-based approaches, including forestry and soil carbon sequestration, things like mineralization, and things like ocean approaches to CDR.
Thanks so much, Emily. And yes, I want to emphasize that DOE as an agency, but also the federal government, is extremely dedicated to pursuing a technology inclusive approach to carbon dioxide removal. And so I saw one of the questions was asking about ocean-based CDR, and we are very excited about pursuing this at DOE. We have started some direct ocean capture work at ARPA-E at DOE, and we want to better understand how different equities in the ocean space are going to fall amongst different offices. One effort that I think is going to be incredibly important is the CDR task force that has been built across agencies, and a report will be forthcoming in the next couple of months. And so please keep an eye out for that, which will include recommendations for CDR across approaches in the federal government. One piece I want to mention when it comes to some nature-based approaches is that, of course, the DOE is an R&D technology-based organization, but there are important aspects to nature-based approaches like monitoring, reporting, and verification that we do have a lot of equities in. And so DOE, especially the Office of Science, can play a really important role in ensuring that the R&D is capable and ready for a lot of these approaches where we need to monitor storage to ensure that it's really durable. And so we're very excited to, pursue that and kind of better understand how it's going to fit into our carbon negative Earthshot, and also just broadly across, different CDR advancements that are going to be made by different agencies. And I'll pass it back to you, Emily.
Thank you so much. Yeah, and to echo, I think, what we've all been saying today, we're very, very excited about a huge suite of carbon management technologies, ranging really from mitigation all the way through many different kinds of removals. We're really looking forward to working not just with our government counterparts and internally, but also with all of you. So I wanted to give a huge thank you for everybody for coming out for our carbon management webinar on 1201 at 1201 today. We're really excited about this, and we'll be posting some of the content that we've been talking about on our website, and I believe on Twitter a little bit as well. I suspect that if you made it to this webinar, you probably know that we have a mailing list. And if you don't know that, our website, fecm.energy.gov, is a good place to go to sign up for that type of thing and see what we're doing. So once again, really want to thank everybody for coming out today. And thank you for all our panelists for talking a bit about what we're doing on carbon management within FECM. Have a great rest of your day. Happy December and happy Carbon Management Day.